All right, so moving on with lesson 5, we're going to take a look at the work of Emily Bronte. In all three Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, three who lived to adulthood, but still not that long, as you'll tragically see in a minute, um, were all really influential during the Victorian period. And so I think Emily was the most talented, and she produced the best work outside of her novels, which is why she's in the anthology. But with the historical context slide we're about to look at, I'd like to um, also explain a little bit about her sisters and why they're important. So all of them spent most of their lives in the small village of Haworth on the wild and bleak Yorkshire moors. So that's where they grew up and really inside their house. Their village was small and remote, but they didn't even get out of the house that much. Charlotte, her older sister who wrote Jane Eyre, did go to school abroad for a little bit longer, and that's kind of the one exception. Their father, Patrick, had immigrated from Ireland, and he was a clergyman. Her mother died when she was 2. By all accounts that I've read in their biography, he was a caring and loving father who really helped them grow up with an appreciation of literature and writing. But a clergyman is very demanding. So at 6, the 4 girls, Charlotte, Emily, and 2 other of Emily's older sisters, were sent to a school designed specifically for daughters of clergy because being a clergyman was so demanding. Um, but it's really tragic. 2 of the older ones, Emily was the youngest of the 4 that went, died because the conditions were so harsh. They were not good living conditions at this school. And that's actually a big thing in Jane Eyre. In the opening of Charlotte's novel, Jane Eyre, you see a school like this, and Jane Eyre's young friend dies. It's a really sad part of that, very sad, but captivating novel. Um, so Emily and Charlotte came home, and the youngest daughter Anne was there, and then their brother Branwell was there. The 4 of the 6 children, those are the ones that survived to adulthood. And so much like many of the authors we've looked at so far in the Victorian period, he educated them at home, and he really gave them, as I said, a great love of literature and writing. Um, as you'll see in a minute, they did a lot of writing at home. Emily was the most reclusive and private of the children. You'll also she was the strongest and boldest, but she just didn't leave home. Despite the isolation of their home life, they had this great literary life, which I've already mentioned. In one of the examples is they composed juvenilia. So similar to Jane Austen in this way, a lot of the writers we've looked at so far have these childhoods where they're mainly educated at home. They have parents who love literature. They do all this reading. One difference with the Bronte sisters is they also did all this writing. So Charlotte and the brother Branwell, who was a very troubled individual, they wrote some actual manuscripts that were similar to novels. And then Emily and Anne wrote uh, a series of stories set in this fictional fantasy land, Gondal. It's pretty impressive. You can read the Bronte's Juvenilia. It's available now in good editions. It is quite interesting. When Charlotte, Emily, and Anne began writing novels, they used pseudonyms, Kerr, Ellis, and Acton, um, because of the gender stereotypes of the day. Being able to publish, it just seemed more likely. Although Charlotte lived the longest, they all had very tragic lives. They were a very sickly family, everyone in it, and did not live long. Um, Charlotte lived the longest and actually published 4 novels, and I think she did reveal her name before she died. But um, Emily's most famous for her novel Wuthering Heights, which she published in 1847, a year before she died. She started on her second novel, and really, I think if she'd lived longer, she would be up there with Dickens or Shakespeare. Wuthering Heights is absolutely brilliant. The beginning of the second novel sounded great, and then tuberculosis claimed her. So that's a tragic loss to the literary world. Um, Anne published 2 novels, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Agnes Grey. She's the least well known of the Bronte sisters, but those are still really interesting novels, well worth reading. And then Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre, of course. as well as a few other novels, 4 total, but the 2 she published after Jane Eyre, Shirley and Villette, are also well worth reading, especially Villette. Jane Eyre is the most popular, but Villette's considered her crowning achievement in terms of complexity and depth. Okay, so that's the Bronte sisters, the family as a whole. What I specifically want to talk about in this lecture is Emily, because she's included in our textbook, or she's the one that's included in our textbook. With all 3 of the novelists we're looking at today, who are some of the most prominent Victorian novelists, we only are looking at short works by them. And in the case of Emily, her poetry. So in terms of form, it's obviously very different from her novel. But thematically, it's very similar. And that's true for all 3 authors. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give an overview of the novels, the themes, the content that are crucial to understanding the novels, and then do an analysis of the short literature and show how those same themes and content are present and form the shape of the short literature so that you get a really good understanding of each of these authors. You can come out of this lecture not having read Wuthering Heights, but still have an understanding of how that novel works and why it's important through looking at Emily's poetry. That's my goal. So this particular slide is going to go through not like a plot summary. There'll be some plot summary that's necessary, and there'll be some spoilers, so I do apologize. Can't think of another way to do it, but mainly we'll be looking at thematic content. So, Wuthering Heights is considered by many to be one of the greatest love stories of all time, and probably outside of Romeo and Juliet, the greatest love story of all time. I'm partial to Tristan and Isolde. Most Victorianists would say it is the greatest love story of all time. The protagonist is a guy named Heathcliff, who's an orphan adopted into a wealthier family, the Earnshaw family, who are kind of representative of the landed gentry. It's set farther back in the past. It's set at the transition from the 18th to the 19th century, so a little over 50 years in the past. And so it was very still much a time before Victorian capitalism, when people lived off the income from their land. And so the Earnshaw are one of these wealthy families, but in the remote rural area. The setting is the Yorkshire moors, isolated and wild, very similar to where Emily grew up. So Heathcliff once, the father, Mr. Earnshaw, just comes home from a business trip, and he's adopted this kid, and no one really knows who he is. So he's an outsider. He's dark and mysterious. A lot of scholars have speculated that he's the illegitimate son of the father, which would make Heathcliff and Cathy's relationship incestuous. He's also come back from Liverpool, which was a big port city where a lot of the slave trading happened. So a lot of the speculation is that Bronte doesn't say this directly, but a lot of scholars have speculated that Heathcliff is the product of an affair Mr. Earnshaw had with a slave, and so he'd actually be black then. But in any case, however you interpret his parentage, he's dark, mysterious, clearly an outsider to the family, and that's important to his role. He and Cathy, the daughter of the family, fall in love, and they have this very tumultuous relationship. It's one of these passionate love affairs. It's very passionate, but it's very tumultuous, not stable. And so the scenery here, the novel is very enmeshed in the setting, the nature, the moors, the setting. It's all enmeshed in that. And so the wildness, the bleakness, the isolation of the moors, it symbolically represents this tumultuous, forbidden love that Heathcliff and Cathy have. So it's an early Victorian novel, only 1847, only 10 years after Victoria took the throne. And it is very much a Victorian novel. We'll talk about that, but it's early enough it has all these romantic roots. And so this huge emphasis on nature through the moors, supernatural, it's a ghost story, it's a ghost love story in some respects. And then Heathcliff, we actually talked about him in lesson 3. He's very much a later incarnation of the Byronic hero. How is he a Byronic hero? Well, he desires what he can't have, just like Manfred desires the. He's not driven by guilt like the Byronic heroes, but he wants what he can't have, just like the Byronic heroes, particularly Manfred, want to be relieved of guilt. What he wants that he can't have is Kathy, because he's the outsider, he's this orphan. Even though he's technically adopted, he's not from that class of society, so they can marry. And he monomaniacally pursues her. Monomania was a condition in the 19th century, best exemplified in literature by Ahab from Moby Dick, who's also a later version of the Byronic hero, a few years after Wuthering Heights. But monomania was fixation on one thing. So all he cares about is Kathy. So much so that he doesn't care if his pursuit of her leads to his own downfall and destruction, which is again very Byronic. The Byronic hero foresees his own death and doesn't relent from his quest, even in the face of it destroying him. The way in which it's a Victorian novel are the limitations. Kathy, who is really also the protagonist, the female counterpart to Heathcliff, they're very emblematic of Victorian society. The neighbor, the Lytton families, or the Lytton family, or the neighboring families, um, she's kind of set to marry the Lytton boy, which is the proper Victorian choice. Even though she loves Heathcliff, doesn't love Lytton, but Lytton represents security and stability, the opposite of Heathcliff, but not love and passion. And so these kind of confining choices, patriarchal double standards, very much what the Victorians grappled with. That's not to say the Romantics didn't. Certainly they did. We've seen that. But I would argue that the response to modernity and the sweeping changes of the Victorian period was such an effort to try to stabilize the sweeping changes that the restrictions placed on women were even more restrictive in the Victorian period than the Romantic period, if you can believe that. Um, and many would argue not only is it Romantic and Victorian, it's also modernist. You have two narrators here who are both unreliable, and there's several layers to the story. It's got several frame narratives. So it's a lot of the literary techniques are very complex and modern. Um, the central theme, the one main idea that I say is the most central idea of the novel that we'll come back to is we study the poetry and we see how these things show up in the poetry. Poetry is that Heathcliff and Kathy's union represents a freedom which they both deeply yearn. For Heathcliff, Kathy's love represents the kind of acceptance he's never had. For Kathy, because Heathcliff's love is forbidden, it represents the kind of freedom she wants from this patriarchal society. Um, so a forbidden love affair representing freedom, that's the central theme of Wuthering Heights. So the poem we're going to look at is The Night Wind. I assigned all the poems in the book, which I think are 6 in total. They're not very long. They're easy to read. I think, Emily is brilliant, Emily Bronte. Wuthering Heights is one of the most brilliant novels in the English language. We just saw why. But her poetry, often overlooked, is great too. And it's short, easy to read. So I love short, easy to read, fun, dark and bleak, but nonetheless fun in an intellectual way poetry. So I'm hoping you'll look at the other poems and maybe write on them in your threads and thesis or even your paper. But the one I've chosen is The Night Wind. The reason being, I think that most of her poems in here show similar themes and even narrative structure to Wuthering Heights, but that's most clearly represented in The Night Wind. So I'm going to go through the Night Wind line by line. It's only 28 lines, 7 4-line stanzas, analyze 8 lines, 2 stanzas at a time. And in doing that, show you how it follows a very similar narrative arc to what we just outlined with Wuthering Heights. So the opening 2 stanzas say, "In summer's mellow midnight, a cloudless moon shone through our open parlor window and rose trees wet with dew. I sat in silence musing, the soft wind waved my hair, it told me heaven was glorious and sleeping earth was fair." So the night wind is personified Personification is when an inanimate or non-human object receives human qualities from the author. But this is like a deep level of personification. You'll see more so as the poem goes on. I mean, we already have the wind caressing her hair, but the wind is like a lover here. The wind is basically Heathcliff, which is going to be my thesis for this poem. Um, but I think it's supported by the text. The wind behaves like a person here. It even speaks to her. I needed not its breathing to bring such thoughts to me, but still it whispered lowly how the dark woods will be. The thick leaves in my murmur are rustling like a dream, and all their myriad voices instinct with spirits seem. So the wind starts talking to her, carrying on my thought from the first couple of stanzas. And it asks her to join him. I'm going to call it him for the reasons I just explained. That might seem odd to you, but that's my interpretation. You're welcome to give and prove your own interpretation. So he's asking her to join him in the dark woods. So this is representing that phrase, how the dark woods will be, and then this very romantic description of the leaves, like a dream filled with spirits and voices. It represents kind of a forbidden place that, to me, is reminiscent of Heathcliff and Cathy's Forbidden Love. This poem was written first. She wrote the novel at the end of her life, but I think she was working through these types of it's kind of this fusion of romantic and Victorian ideas, and the novel was like the crescendo. Um, so working through them earlier on in the poetry. So I'll say resembles Wuthering Heights or resembles Heathcliff, even though this is earlier. I said, go, gentle singer, thy wooing voice is kind, but do not think its music has power to reach my mind. Play with the scented flower, the young tree's supple bough, and leave my human feelings in their own course to flow. The speaker is tempted by the wind. She wants to go with him. She wants to do this. His wooing voice is kind, but she rejects him. She says, go and experience this nature, this forbidden romantic place on your own. Um, so she says, and leave my human feelings in their own course to flow. So he's stirred something up in her, but she's still not chosen to pursue it, which is like Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff stirs this passion, this idea of freedom, of pursuing something forbidden in Cathy, but she knows that would go against the Victorian standards, and so she ultimately makes the more Victorian choice. And you see the speaker doing that here when she's telling the wind to go on and indulge in these forbidden things we both love on your own. Next stanza, the wanderer would not heed me, its kiss grew warmer still. Oh, come, it sighed so sweetly, I'll win thee against thy will. I'll win thee against thy will. So the wind continues to pursue her, even though she's rejected him, which is what Heathcliff does. After Cathy rejects him and chooses to marry the neighbor Linton, he's gone mysteriously for a few years, comes back wealthy and pursues her and employs violent means, not violence against her, but against others. So when he says, I'll pursue thee against thy will, to me, that's a similar kind of like the violent, romantic, Byronic hero here. He's going to pursue her at all costs, is the idea in Wuthering Heights. And again, I think that's echoed here with I'll win thee against thy will. And also the idea of pursuing her after she said no. That's very Byronic. And then the final two stanzas, penultimate stanza. When we were not friends from childhood, have I not loved thee as long as thou, the solemn night, whose silence wakes my song. So again, in Wuthering Heights, they grow up together because he's adopted by the family when he's very young. And so kind of part of his argument for being with her is this shared childhood experience. We see that in what the wind is saying here in the poem. Finally, last stanza. And when thy heart is resting beneath the church aisle stone, I shall have time for mourning, and thou for being alone. So it's a bit of a spoiler here, I'm sorry, but the really crucial points I'm going to make on the next slide, you need to know the spoiler. Cathy dies eventually. The easiest way to explain it would be she starves herself when she's torn between her husband and Heathcliff. and he mourns her the rest of the novel, and constructs her grave and what will eventually be his grave, so that their bodies, they're right next to each other, will deteriorate together. So with him mourning her after she's gone by the stone where she's buried, again, very reminiscent of the ending of Wuthering Heights, in my opinion. So, what did we learn from this poem? There's a lot here that connects to the novel. So they have similar themes and narrative arcs. Covered that. The wind is like Heathcliff. It's dark, mysterious, connected to nature. In this case, it literally is nature. She calls it a wanderer, so it's an orphan like Heathcliff. Um, he's infatuated by her and willing to pursue her even to the point of violence. So the wind, like Heathcliff, is this very Byronic hero. Um, for the speaker, he represents these things I mentioned before: freedom, the freedom of a forbidden love, but she chooses not to pursue it. Um, what I think is really interesting and why I spoiled the ending of the novel is that, um, and not all of it, there's a whole second generation of their children it deals with, but um, why I spoiled a big twist in the novel is that making the Victorian choice, rejecting the forbidden romantic choice, is not necessarily the right thing. It doesn't turn out well for her. She dies. And we don't quite see all of that here, but we see that she does die before the wind. And we see that she doesn't really want to do this, but she's doing it anyway, which seems to be the case. And in Wuthering Heights, she's torn between her husband and this passionate love affair she's having with Heathcliff, and she feels like she has no options, no way out of this, and she essentially starves herself. So it's this very, I would say, feminist critique of Victorian society. But I think we see that in the poem more minutely in her wanting to go with the wind here and choosing not to. Last point is the wind seems to be immortal. I mean, obviously the wind it doesn't die, but we're thinking of it as a personified character. That evokes the supernatural romantic elements of Wuthering Heights because Heathcliff does eventually die, but as I said, he set up the grave so that the bodies will decompose together, and then the narrator, who's this guest visiting Wuthering Heights, that's actually the name of the estate where the Earnshaw family lives, this guest visiting it a number of years later and looking back, um, he sees ghosts. He believes he sees ghosts, and that perhaps they're the ghosts of Kathy and Heathcliff. So if that's the way you interpret Wuthering Heights, then a difference would be the speaker and the wind don't end up together here. But a similarity would be immortality, that this romantic forbidden love has lived on beyond the grave, which we do get with the speaker, or a hint of it, an illusion of it. A lot of what I'm saying here is we're kind of hinting to themes that are more fully fleshed out in Wuthering Heights because she writes it 7 years later and it's a full novel. But a hint at that with the wind, outlasting her here and waiting by her grave. So these are the themes that are central to understanding Wuthering Heights. Again, a forbidden love representing freedom. I think we really see that in the dialogue between the speaker and the wind in this poem. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you'll even read Wuthering Heights if you haven't. If you do, it's a great read.